The Red Keep stood tall against the darkened sky of King's Landing. Fires still burned in the streets, the scent of ash and blood filling the air. Arya Stark moved like a shadow, her body covered in the dust of the ruined city. She had seen death before, but this was different. This was destruction on a scale she had never imagined. The people of King's Landing had screamed for mercy, but Cersei Lannister had never been one to offer it. Neither had Daenerys Targaryen, but Arya had come for one reason alone: Cersei Lannister. She had spent years perfecting the art of killing, training with the faceless men, learning to be silent, swift, and merciless. The name Cersei had been on her list since she was a child, a reminder of the pain, the suffering, the countless lives ruined by the Queen's greed. Now, with the city in flames and chaos ruling the streets, there would never be a better time. Arya moved through the ruined halls of the Red Keep, her dagger gripped tightly in her hand. The castle was nearly empty, abandoned by those who had once served the Queen. Even the gold cloaks had fled, knowing there was no victory left to be had. Only the mountain and Qyburn remained by Cersei's side, but Arya had already seen them fall. The mountain, a mindless beast of destruction, had been taken down by his own brother in a battle that had shaken the castle itself. Qyburn had died, like a bug, crushed in an instant. Now Cersei was alone. Arya found her in the map room, the massive painting of Westeros beneath her feet, cracked and stained with dust. The once mighty queen stood with her back to Arya, her golden hair a mess, her face streaked with tears. There was no crown on her head, no army at her back. She was just a woman now, one who had run out of power, out of options. Arya stepped forward, and the sound of her boots echoed through the empty chamber. Cersei turned, her red-rimmed eyes locking onto Arya's face. For a moment there was only silence between them. "You," Cersei whispered, almost in disbelief. Arya didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Cersei took a shaky breath, glancing toward the doorway as if expecting Jaime to come for her. But he wasn't coming. He was dead beneath the rubble, buried along with the past they had built together. "You think this makes you a hero?" Cersei asked, her voice trembling. "Killing me?" Arya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, "but it's necessary." Cersei let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "I was a queen. I ruled this city. You think you're better than me? You're just another killer." Arya took another step forward. "And so were you." Cersei's hands clenched into fists. "You want me to beg, to cry, to apologize? I won't." Arya didn't care. She had already made up her mind. With a swift, practiced motion, she lunged forward, needle flashing in the dim light. Cersei tried to step back, but there was nowhere left to go. The dagger slid into her stomach, deep and precise. Cersei gasped, her hands clutching at Arya's arm as if she could push her away. But Arya was unmoving. Cersei's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, her body sprawled across the painted map of Westeros. Her fingers reached weakly toward the lands she had once ruled, but they would never be hers again. Arya knelt beside her, watching as the life faded from her eyes. There was no glory in this kill, no victory. Just another name crossed off her list. As the last breath left Cersei's lips, Arya rose, wiping her blade clean. The city still burned outside, but her mission was complete. She turned and walked away, leaving the fallen queen behind. The fires of King's Landing continued to rage, their glow casting long shadows across the ruined streets. Arya moved like a ghost through the destruction, her face streaked with soot and blood. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh, the cries of the dying lost beneath the crackling of flames. She didn't look back. Cersei Lannister was dead. The woman who had ordered the execution of her father, who had played her games of power without a care for the lives destroyed in the process, was gone. Yet there was no satisfaction in it. No victory, just another death in a world drowning in them. Arya had thought it would feel different. That vengeance would bring her some sense of peace, but all she felt was exhaustion. As she moved through the Red Keep, stepping over the broken bodies of Lannister soldiers and civilians alike, she heard the distant flapping of wings. Drogon. Somewhere above, Daenerys Targaryen still ruled the sky, her dragon finishing what she had started. The city was already hers, but that hadn't stopped her from burning it to the ground. Arya clenched her jaw. Daenerys was not the queen she had once claimed to be. She had stood before the people of Westeros, promising peace, justice, a better world, but in the end she had chosen fire and blood. And now there was one question left in Arya's mind: who deserved to sit on the Iron Throne? Not Daenerys. Not after this. She had just killed Cersei Lannister, the last true obstacle standing in the Dragon Queen's path. But was that the right choice? Had she simply traded one tyrant for another? Arya made her way toward the streets, stepping over rubble, past the dying and the dead. She saw a little girl curled in the arms of her mother, both of them nothing more than blackened corpses. Her fingers tightened around Needle, the Queen of Ashes. That was all Daenerys would ever be. As she turned a corner, she saw Jon Snow moving. Through the ruins, his white direwolf ghost by his side. His face was grim, his eyes filled with the same horror Arya felt in her own heart. He had seen what Daenerys had done. He knew the truth now. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was no need for words. Jon knew. Arya knew. Daenerys Targaryen had to die, but how? Arya had spent years learning to be a killer, perfecting the art of silence and deception. She had taken down the Night King himself. She had just killed a queen, and maybe, before this was all over, she would kill one more. Jon stepped closer, his voice low. "It's over." Arya shook her head. "Not yet." Jon's gaze darkened, and he looked past her toward the remains of the Red Keep. "Cersei?" Arya simply nodded. Jon exhaled, shaking his head. "And Daenerys?" Arya glanced up toward the Ygritte sky, where the dragons still flew. "Not yet." Jon was silent for a long moment, then finally he nodded. Neither of them said it out loud, but the decision had already been made. One queen had fallen, another would follow. The fires had begun to die down, but the city still smoldered, the air thick with the stench of death. Arya and Jon stood in the ruins of King's Landing, surrounded by the wreckage Daenerys had left in her wake. The cries of the survivors echoed in the distance, desperate voices calling for help that would never come. Jon looked around, his expression grim. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the force of his frustration. This was not the war he had fought for. This was not the victory he had wanted. Arya watched him closely, studying the turmoil written across his face. She could see the battle raging inside him, the conflict between loyalty and justice. "She burned them," Jon finally said, his voice hoarse. "She burned them all." Arya nodded. "And you still call her your queen?" Jon didn't answer. Right away. He ran a hand through his dirt-covered hair, exhaling slowly. "I swore an oath." Arya stepped closer, her voice sharp. "An oath to a murderer, to a tyrant." Jon turned to her, his eyes dark. "She wasn't always like this." Arya let out a bitter laugh. "Power changes people. It made Cersei a monster. And now Daenerys is no different." Jon looked away, his jaw tight. Deep down, he knew Arya was right. He had seen the madness in Daenerys' eyes as she rained fire upon the city. He had watched as innocent people burned beneath Drogon's flames. But still, she was Daenerys. She was the woman he had pledged himself to, the woman he had believed in. "She has to die," Arya said, her voice steady. Jon turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "And who's going to do it?" "You." Arya held his gaze. "I killed the Night King. I killed Cersei. If you won't do it, I will." John shook his head. It's not that simple. Arya took a step forward, her voice lowering. It is that simple, John. If we don't stop her now, she'll keep going. She'll march on the rest of Westeros. She'll burn every city that refuses to kneel. And the next time she does it, she won't hesitate. John clenched his jaw, staring at the ground. He wanted to deny it, to believe that Daenerys could be reasoned with, but after what she had done, how could he? Arya continued, her voice softer now. She's not the same woman you followed beyond the wall. She's not the same woman who freed the slaves and broke chains. She's the daughter of the Mad King, and she's proving it every second she sits on that throne. John closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. When he opened them again, he looked at Arya with a new kind of determination. How? He asked. Arya tilted her head slightly. The same way I killed Cersei. The same way I killed the Night King. She won't see it coming. John exhaled slowly. You're sure? Arya nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. John hesitated for a long moment, then finally he nodded. It was decided. Daenerys Targaryen had to die. As the two of them walked away from the ruins, heading toward what was left of their allies, Arya could feel the weight of what they were about to do settle over them. One last kill, one last queen to fall. The morning sun rose over the ruins of King's Landing, casting an eerie glow over the city of the dead. Smoke still drifted through the air, the remnants of Daenerys' wrath hanging over the streets like ghosts. The once great capital of Westeros had been reduced to ash, and its new queen sat upon a throne built on the bones of the innocent. Arya and Jon moved silently through the ruins, careful to avoid the Unsullied and Dothraki patrolling the streets. They were no longer soldiers fighting for a cause. They were enforcers of Daenerys' will. The war had ended, but the bloodshed had not. Jon's mind was a battlefield of its own. His heart ached with doubt, but the truth was unavoidable. Daenerys was not the ruler Westeros needed. He had fought beside her, believed in her, loved her. But love was not enough to blind him to what she had become. Arya, on the other hand, was as sharp as ever. Her purpose was clear, her hands steady. She had spent years hunting the names on her list, and now one final name remained. They reached what was left of the great hall, where the Iron Throne loomed like a cursed relic. Daenerys was inside, surrounded by her remaining followers, her reign secured by fear. She won't be alone, Jon murmured. Grey Worm won't leave her side. Arya's expression didn't change. Then we take him out first. Jon shook his head. No. Too many eyes. We do this clean. Arya considered his words. A direct attack would be too dangerous. She couldn't fight her way through an army alone. I can get close, Jon continued, his voice heavy. She trusts me. Arya frowned. You still love her. Jon looked away, unable to deny it. That doesn't matter. Arya studied him for a moment. It does if you hesitate. Jon met her gaze. I won't. A long silence stretched between them before Arya finally nodded. If you fail, I'll finish it. Jon swallowed hard. He knew Arya meant it. Together, they moved toward the Red Keep, their plan taking shape with each step. Jon would enter alone, his loyalty still unquestioned in Daenerys' eyes. Arya would remain hidden, watching from the shadows, ready to strike, if needed. As they approached, unsullied guards blocked their path. Their spears crossed, a silent warning. I need to see the Queen, Jon said firmly. The soldiers exchanged a look, then stepped aside. Jon turned to Arya one last time, his expression unreadable. If this is the last time we speak. Arya shook her head. Don't. Jon hesitated, then gave a small nod before stepping through the gates, leaving Arya behind in the ruins. She watched him disappear into the darkness, gripping Needle tightly. Inside the Red Keep, The throne room was eerily silent. The Iron Throne stood before Jon, its jagged metal edges glinting in the dim light, filtering through the broken ceiling. It was a throne built on the suffering of countless men and women, and now it belonged to the woman who had burned a city to claim it. Daenerys stood before it, her hand grazing the metal, her expression unreadable. She looked smaller than before, lost in the vast emptiness of the ruined hall, but the fire in her eyes still burned. She turned when she heard Jon approach, a soft smile breaking across her lips. "You came," she said. Her voice was almost gentle. Jon swallowed hard, forcing himself to step closer. "I needed to see you." Daenerys searched his face, her gaze filled with something between love and suspicion. "Do you see it now?" She gestured to the ruined throne. "What we've built." Jon glanced around at the destruction, his heart heavy. "What you've built." Daenerys' expression darkened for a moment before softening again. "It had to be this way." She took a step toward him, her voice almost pleading. "You understand, don't you? They feared me, they wouldn't accept me, but now they will. Now they have no choice." Jon clenched his jaw. "You burned them alive." Daenerys reached for his hand. "I did what I had to, for the world. We're going to build." Jon hesitated. His heart ached as he looked at her, at the woman he had once believed in. He wanted to believe her now. He wanted to trust that there was still good in her, but the screams of the dying still echoed in his mind. Daenerys saw the conflict in his eyes and stepped even closer. "I love you, Jon. We can do this together." Jon exhaled slowly. He had made his decision long before stepping into this room. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Daenerys let out a breath, closing her eyes as she leaned into him, and then the dagger slid between her ribs. Daenerys gasped, her eyes flying open in shock. Jon held her tightly as her body trembled, her fingers clutching at his cloak. Tears filled her eyes. "Jon, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. Daenerys' legs gave out, and he gently lowered her to the ground. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the floor of the throne room. She reached for him, her breathing ragged, but the light in her eyes was already fading. Jon watched as the last breath left her lips, his heart shattering. It was over. The Queen of Ashes had fallen. Jon knelt beside Daenerys' lifeless body, his hands stained with her blood. His breath was heavy, his heart a storm of emotions, grief, guilt, relief. He had done what needed to be done, but it did not feel like a victory. The throne room was silent except for the distant crackling of fire and the low hum of the wind passing through the shattered walls. The Iron Throne stood before him, unclaimed. Once again, a cursed relic that had driven so many to madness. Jon closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. But the moment was short-lived. A low growl echoed through the hall. Jon turned sharply just as Drogon landed outside the throne room, his massive black wings sending gusts of hot air through the ruins. The dragon's golden eyes locked onto Daenerys' body and then onto Jon. A deep, rumbling sorrow vibrated through Drogon's chest. He stepped forward, his claws scraping against the stone, his nostrils flaring. Then he let out a roar, a sound so filled with agony and rage that it shook the very foundations of the Red Keep. Jon didn't move. He knew he was about to die. Drogon reared back, his chest glowing with fire, ready to unleash his fury. Jon stared into the beast's eyes, waiting for the inevitable, but then the flames did not come for him. Instead, Drogon turned his head and unleashed his fire upon the Iron Throne itself. The metal melted under the intense heat, the once mighty seat of power turning into a pool of molten steel. The throne that had cost so many lives, that had corrupted so many souls, was no more. Jon watched in shock as Drogon stepped forward, lowering his massive head to nudge Daenerys' lifeless body. The dragon let out a soft, sorrowful whimper before carefully wrapping his talons around her and lifting her into the air. Without another glance at Jon, Drogon flapped his mighty wings and took to the sky, carrying Daenerys away into the unknown. Jon stood in the ruined throne room alone. It was over, but now came the hardest part, facing the world he had just changed forever. Jon stood frozen in the throne room, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a mountain. The city still smouldered outside, the fires slowly dying, but the true battle was just beginning. The Queen was dead, and soon the world would know. He turned, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall as he made his way toward the broken doors of the Red Keep. The cold air hit him as he stepped out into the ruins. The streets were filled with ash and silence, the city's survivors too broken to even mourn. He moved forward, his body tense, his heart hammering. Then he saw them. Grey Worm stood at the head of a line of Lannister prisoners, his sword already dripping with blood. The Unsullied surrounded him, their expressions cold and unreadable. The last remnants of Daenerys' army waited for their next command. Grey Worm turned as Jon approached. His dark eyes were filled with something unreadable, rage, sorrow, suspicion. He took one look at Jon and knew something was wrong. "Where is she?" Grey Worm demanded. Jon clenched his jaw. His hand hovered near his sword, but he knew that was not the way. "Not yet. She's gone." Grey Worm's face darkened. "Gone." Jon held his gaze. "She's dead." A murmur spread through the Unsullied ranks. The Dothraki, still on horseback, whispered among themselves. Grey Worm's grip tightened around his sword. "What did you do?" Jon swallowed. "What had to be done?" There was a beat of silence. Then Grey Worm lunged. Jon barely had time to react as the first strike came, steel clashing against steel. He stumbled back, parrying the blow, his instincts taking over. The Unsullied hesitated, waiting for their commander's order, but Grey Worm did not pause. "You betrayed her," he snarled, his attacks coming fast, furious, fueled by grief and rage. Jon dodged, blocking another strike. "She gave us no choice." Grey Worm roared in fury, his blade cutting through the air, but Jon was faster. He sidestepped, knocking the sword from Grey Worm's hands. The blade clattered to the ground. The soldiers around them tensed. Jon stood over Grey Worm, his own sword trembling in his grip. He could end it here, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, lowering his weapon. "It's over." Grey Worm stared up at him, breathing hard. For a moment it seemed as though he might lunge again. But then he looked around, saw the Unsullied. Watching, saw the city in ruins, saw what little remained of their cause, and he fell still. Jon turned to the gathered soldiers. "The war is over," he said, his voice steady. "No more killing." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, the Unsullied began lowering their weapons. The Dothraki shifted uneasily, but did not charge. It was done. The Queen was dead. Now they had to decide what came next. The silence of the battlefield stretched over them like a heavy shroud. The war was truly over, but the scars it left behind would never fade. Jon stood in the ruins of King's Landing, surrounded by those who had once fought for Daenerys. Now they had no queen, no orders, only the weight of what had been done. Grey Worm looked at Jon with a fire still burning in his eyes, but it was different now. There was no more blind rage, only grief. He sheathed his sword and turned away. "She wanted to break the wheel," he muttered, "and you killed her." Jon swallowed hard. "She became the wheel." The tension in the air slowly settled as the soldiers around them accepted the truth. Some bowed their heads in sorrow, others in silent understanding. The war had taken everything from them. There was nothing left to fight for. Jon didn't wait for their judgment. He turned and walked away, past the soldiers, past the ruins, toward the one place he knew he could find some kind of answer. The throne room was empty now, the Iron Throne nothing more than molten steel. The past had been burned away, but the future remained uncertain. And then the doors creaked open. Tyrion Lannister stepped inside, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, with grief. He had expected this moment. "She's dead, isn't she?" Tyrion asked softly. Jon nodded. Tyrion let out a long, slow breath. "You did the right thing." Jon looked away. "Then why does it feel like I didn't?" Tyrion shook his head. "Because you're not like the others who came before you. You never wanted the throne." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But someone has to sit on it." Jon stiffened. "Not me." Tyrion studied him for a long moment. "Then who?" The question hung in the air, like a sword waiting to fall. Westeros had been shattered, its people broken. They needed a leader. But Jon had never wanted to be a king. The days that followed were filled with uneasy discussions. The remaining lords and ladies of Westeros gathered in the Dragon Pit, debating who should rule. Sansa, Bran, Davos, Gendry, Brienne, they all played their part in deciding the fate of the realm. In the end, it was Bran Stark who was chosen. "The past is written," he had said, his voice calm, distant. "But the future is yet to come." Jon accepted the decision with relief. He had never belonged in the halls of kings. His place was elsewhere. Grey Worm did not forgive him, but he did not kill him either. Instead, he declared that Jon would take the Black once more, returning to the Night's Watch, to a life beyond the realm of politics and power. Jon did not argue. He was tired of war, of blood, of the endless game of thrones. He had done what he had to. As he rode north past the wall, beyond the ruins of everything he had once fought for, Arya watched him go. She had played her part. She had avenged her family, ended the rule of tyrants, and walked the road of vengeance until there was no one left to kill. Now it was time for her to forge her own path. Without a word, she set sail toward the unknown, toward whatever lay west of Westeros, and so the last of the Starks parted ways, each walking toward a future filled with uncertainty. The Iron Throne was gone. The war was over. But the scars of it all would remain forever.